Right. There we go.
Welcome, everybody, to EdTech Routines, easy ways to get learners using technology in any class. And we are going to be going over a number of routines and trying some things out today. And we only have an hour, so let's get started. Nick, do you want to move on to the next slide, please?
All right. So welcome. Like Susan said, my name is Nicholas Houlson. I've been on the statewide team for maybe 2 or 3 years. I can't precisely remember at this moment. And I work alongside Susan for Literacy Minnesota. And we've done a lot with thinking about how to build ed tech routines and how to incorporate them in the classroom. And over this presentation, we hope to share some of that knowledge, as well as confess maybe some of our sins when it comes
Speak for yourself,
to
Nick.
integrating routines and things that we could maybe try to do better. Susan, was there anything you would like to say?
Just hi, I'm Susan, and my email address is there if you ever want to contact me after the session for questions or ideas for things for future sessions. So let's get started, and I'm going to go over the agenda for the session. So we're going to start out talking about why routines in the first place, because we want to ground ourselves in the why of what we're doing and think about what makes for an effective routine. And then we are going to introduce a couple of resources where you can find some routines to use in your class. So we will be looking at the EdTech Integration Strategy Toolkit. I'll be talking about that. And then Nick is going to be talking about some routines that are free for anyone, even if you are not a Northstar subscriber, that can be found on the Northstar Digital Literacy website. And then he and I are both going to be showing a few routines that you can try out in your class. And if you were just in Dr. Glenda Rose's session, she gave you a 10-second introduction to how to do a QR code in your browser. We're going to go a little bit more slowly and walk you through how to do that because I think it's a really useful skill for teachers. We're also going to talk about how to make a human readable URL. I don't have that on the agenda, but it's in there. Nick is going to dig deep into some word wall activities, and then I'm going to share a couple of routines that teachers have developed and used in our best cohort, talking about readiness for learning check-ins at the beginning of class and then exit tickets on Google Forms at the end of class. So that's what we're going to do. Let's get started. Move on to the next slide, and we're going to talk about why routines. So, yeah, if you were in Dr. Glenda Rose's session, she talked a little bit about the affective barrier, the anxiety, and the emotional barriers that prevent learning, that make it hard to take in new information because you are too stressed out and anxious. But in addition to that, that emotional barrier that can prevent learning, we also want to think about cognitive load. And if that's a concept that's new to you in terms of terms, I guarantee it's not new to you in your lived experience of the world. Because cognitive load is just about how many things have you got going on in your brain at one time, and how are you able to focus your cognitive resources? So why this matters for routines is that we are dealing with folks who are learning print literacy, digital literacy, and English language in many cases at the same time. And that's a lot of stuff for your brain to process all at the same time. And so what happens is you want to introduce some technology in your classroom, and it's new, it's difficult. The language might be new and difficult, and maybe the print is also new and difficult, and it's just too much. And then none of it actually gets processed very effectively. So a routine can help because over time, as you learn the routine and the routine becomes something easy, you can move away from learning how to do the thing and switch over into doing the thing to learn something. And then you can use that technology routine to access the content. So I often talk about for teachers that what you want to do when you introduce a new technology or a new technology routine is start with language and skills that your learners have already mastered. Really easy stuff. Practice writing your name or something so that they can move into learning how to do the activity. And then once you've got the how to do the activity, you switch over and to use that activity to do more complex content. So that's one of the big reasons for routines. The second one is we all don't have much time, right? I hear from teachers all the time that they don't have a lot of prep time. And routines save us as teachers on prep time. If you're doing the same activity every day or every week, and all you have to do is switch out the content, that's a lot less prep than inventing something new all the time. And another reason is to sort of normalize technology use. And I know Dr. Rose talked about this in her session too, that technology can be scary. It can be this foreign thing that maybe I'm risking sharing information that I don't feel safe doing, or I feel vulnerable. And we want to reduce that barrier, that emotional barrier for our students by making technology use a normal thing. But there are emotional barriers for us as teachers too. Trying new things in front of other people is scary, right? And therefore, we might feel emotionally anxious or worried about our teaching skills. We don't want to look dumb in front of our students, so then we don't necessarily want to try the technology. So routines can help with that too. Learn a skill, a tool, learn to use it well, and then it becomes just a normal part of the way you deliver class, and you don't have to feel that anxiety anymore. And I know, Nick, you added this building learner expectations bullet on this slide, and what did you want to add about that?
It's very tied to cognitive load, and that contents and skills can kind of more easily be onboarded via routines. Is once learners get used to a routine and come to expect that routine, that helps put your class in a certain groove. It helps set the pace and tempo for a class. Experienced students, if it's something like not a class, if it's a free-form lab with individualized learning, and you're otherwise occupied, an experienced student, if you put all that time and investment into building a routine and you kind of get it up and running, an experienced student can help a new student by onboarding them or by showing what to do or by flagging to you, the teacher, that this person needs help getting introduced to the routine. So in many ways, building routines are paying things forward. And of course, when you think about it, that's one of those self-evident things, that building these routines and helping to build learner expectations will make the whole machine kind of run smoother.
Hmm? And this is true for routines, whether they're technologically based or not, but adding the technology increases that cognitive load by another factor. So I think routines are particularly important for technology. All right, let's go on to the next slide, unless there are any questions in the chat. I haven't seen any, but feel free to throw questions in the chat at any time. We're happy to take questions. So one of the sources of routines that I would like to highlight today is called the EdTech Strategy Integration Toolkit. And this is a resource provided by the EdTech Center at World Education. Is everybody familiar with the EdTech Center? Is that an organization I should introduce? I'm curious. Not familiar. Okay. So the EdTech Center is a project of the World Education Organization, and it's specifically designed to deliver professional development, training, research, resources for adult educators on using technology to enhance and strengthen adult learning. So they do research, professional development, and provide resources. And one of their projects is the IDEAL Consortium, which I mentioned in the opening session. And that is a consortium of state adult education leaders working on digital skills. And the IDEAL Consortium is a way for us who do this work to network with others in other states. So if you came to the session with Dr. Glenda Rose, I know her and have connected with her and was able to invite her to this conference today through the IDEAL Consortium. And so the EdTech Strategy Integration Toolkit is another project that comes out of the EdTech Center at World Ed. And it is crowdsourced. It is not content that is developed strictly by the staff at the EdTech Center. It's created by adult educators. Things they have put together, organized, and then built into an app and a website that anybody can access. And when you head on over there, which we'll do in just a minute, I'll have Nick click the link and head on over there in a minute. What you'll find is that you can view in different ways. You can look at routines by their instructional purpose. So is it assessment? Is it content delivery? Is it building community? What are we trying to do? You can look by tool. So, okay, I know I want to teach my students, I don't know, spreadsheets. What are some routines that use spreadsheets? And then you can also look by skill. So what kind of skills am I trying to deliver to my students? What are some routines that'll help me do that? And then each routine includes a description of the routine. So what is this thing? It has an evidence base that talks about, okay, what are the research based reasons why this routine is effective for adult learning. And then an overview of how to do it in your class. It'll have connections to digital skill frameworks showing, okay, so if you're doing this routine, here are the digital skills your students will need or will develop. And then many of them also have samples and templates that you can use. So Nick, do you want to click that link and we'll just pop over there really quick out of our slides and take a look at it?
Sure.
And Susan, just to note, some folks are saying in the chat that they're not able to access it through the link that we shared. Just
Oh,
to note that you do need to sign up to get access. It's free, right? So,
it's free. Yeah.
Yeah, this particular resource, however, is at this URL.
Right.
I believe
So
so.
maybe we had the link wrong, but this one is the correct one. So let's make sure that one's in the chat. You do not need to sign up with Glide to access it. That's if you want to make an app with Glide. So I don't know what happened with the image on this page, but for whatever reason, the image on the homepage doesn't load. But if you could click, Nick, to the integrations tab.
All right.
You can see here, this is how you can look by instructional purpose. So if you click on instructional routines, yep, right there, then you can see, okay, here's some different categories of instructional activities that you might want to do. So let's click on that one, reflect and assess. And then you can see here are some different activity routines for your class that are for assessment and reflection. And they're all showing you what's the tool, and then the title of it. And then once you get into it, it'll have all those other details that I mentioned. So this is what it looks like. We'll look at another one in greater detail later. But I just wanted to kind of walk you through how you can navigate around here. And then you'll see across the top, there's the EdTech Tools section, so you can look by tool. And then there's the digital skills section, so you can look by what skill is being built. So like I said, this is crowdsourced. These are all routines that were developed by real adult educators out there in the field doing the work. And they've all been field tested with real learners. So we'll be looking at some routines from the toolkit a little bit more later, but for now we can go back to the slides. And I'm going to turn it over to Nick to talk about another resource from Northstar. Oh, and this was,
right,
I did a
oops.
screenshot here, but I decided to go to the website. So we'll skip the screenshot.
All right. Let me open up my chat window really quick. How many people in the chat just give a one-word answer, or feel free to shout it out? How many people are familiar with Northstar? All right. Yes. Up, I see two or three no's, one a little bit. So most of you might be familiar. For those of you who don't know, Northstar is a resource we designed for digital literacy instruction. It has both a curriculum to help organize digital literacy classes and also self-paced modules. Somebody says, absolutely familiar. That's great. I myself use it to help train self-paced, or to help provide a self-paced option for students who are looking to improve their own digital literacy skills. It has a lot on there. The website has a lot. And one of the things that we're going to highlight today is one element of Northstar. They designed certain routines that were supposed to be plug and play to help introduce some basic digital literacy skills into the classroom. These were mostly made for an ABE or ELL context, but they were designed to be lightweight and easily adaptable. I'm going to go out of my slides here. Oops. Let's take a field trip. The routines that I'm talking about are part of Northstar's curriculum. You can find it by going to the features page. Scroll down to the curriculum tab. And scroll down to the small module that highlights the routines. Is everybody seeing the PDF document?
Yep, I can see it.
Yep, we're seeing it.
All right. Good. Do you want to practice your reading skills like I did not last night? I went down here to the curriculum tabs, and the Northstar curriculum is wide and expansive, but we'll be looking at this blue column with the specific routines. We'll take a look at the first set of routines, which are all about orienting students on their devices. The routines are all made in Google Slides. When you select Make a Copy, it will port one over to your Google account if you have one. All right. And here they are themselves. This routine is a total of 17 slides, or rather routines. It contains 2 of them. They have clear teacher objectives, as well as notes oriented for either a teacher or a volunteer. The routines give a recommended kind of scaffolding for students. You might want to practice for a first timer. If you're just setting these routines up, putting them into motion, you might want to practice writing in notebooks before, kind of the routine before the routine. Let's go into slideshow. This particular routine is simultaneously English practice with prepositions and digital literacy practice. We're kind of taking a cue from Dart and using digital literacy as the content and the actual routine as the scaffold. There's some interactive thing. Oops, these are mostly speaking practice. If I go back to my teacher notes, the routines are based on a 1, 2, 3 method, an I do, where the teacher models the routine. So I would go ahead, I would be blabbing to my students, is this a touch screen? Yes, this device is a touch screen. Is this device a touch screen? Hold up a device that is not a touch screen. No, this device is not a touch screen. We do, either working alongside the class or dividing them into pairs, asking learners to check if their devices are touchscreens. And you do, where the learners begin to produce those outcomes. The learners practice writing this device as a touchscreen in their notebooks in this particular routine. Other examples could be them using a touchscreen or practicing in conversation. The routine goes through a bunch of reps. I always, when I'm describing to students why these routines are effective, I always use a metaphor. I say it's kind of like going to a gym. You want to repeat to kind of build familiarity and to strength train yourself, for lack of a better word. As you're getting to know these concepts, things will get easier. Routine goes over various types of devices, including cameras, ports. These are mapped onto the Northstar standards, which are also available in that PDF document. So if you're curious, hey, what specific skills are these routines meant to practice? You can find that information here. And then the PowerPoint goes into a second routine. I would recommend chopping it up as needed. You might have the bandwidth to include 2 per class session. You might only have the bandwidth to include 1. You might have the bandwidth to include half of 1 and kind of limit it to a 10, 15-minute practice, or make that your goal. But give yourself some grace. The first time that you implement this, you might have to give some extra time to work all the kinks out. Certainly, I'd be happy to send the link. It might also be further up, but this is the link to that PDF specifically. Astrid has helpfully put in the link to this website, which also contains more information and answers frequently asked questions about availability and other things regarding Northstar. Let's go back to our presentation.
Do we have any other questions before we move on? Please feel free to throw them in the chat or just unmute and call it your question. Has anybody here used any of the routines from the Northstar website before?
Well, thank you. I'm
Yeah,
explaining
Thank
this very clearly.
you
Yeah.
so much. And Irina
Always
and
great to
Todd
hear
have
as a teacher. to
And it's
calibrate.
all right. Well, if there are no additional questions,
Yeah.
let's move on.
Before moving on, I want to encourage, please use these. We're hungry for teacher experience. We developed them, I believe, about 2 years ago, and we're really looking to see how they do out in the world.
There is a question here from Michelle asking about the lesson links. So those do link to the Northstar Online Learning and the curriculum, which are subscription-based part of Northstar. So Northstar has both free resources and subscription-based resources. So if you do not have a Northstar subscription at your organization, then you would need to purchase that in order to access the full curriculum and the online learning pieces. But these routines and the slide decks are part of the free resources section. If you are working in Minnesota adult education, all Minnesota adult education programs do have a Northstar license, so you would be able to get access through your program.
All right. One final question. How would you incorporate this into a conversation class? You could either make these routines the focus of your conversation class or steal some of the questions, put them in a grab bag of questions. It doesn't all have to be digital literacy. You can sneak it in there. It's one of many fair game topics for a conversation class. If you're practicing with lower level learners, that particular routine that we showed has a lot of do you questions. You can practice yes, no answers or full sentences.
One of the other routines looks at making sure you know how to connect to the Wi-Fi. That's a really rich topic for conversation too. If you think about if you're in a public place and you want to get on the Wi-Fi, being able to ask about that is really useful skill for English language learners to develop too. What's the Wi-Fi connection here? What's the password? And just getting connected. So you might want to look at that one for your conversation class.
All right, but now we will truck on.
Trucking on. It's already almost 11:30.
Yeah, we're going to look at more routines,
Yes,
subroutines, if you will.
subroutines or some tools to deliver some routines. So let's take a look at QR codes. So if you were, like I said, in Glenda Rose's presentation earlier, she showed you in about 10 seconds how to do a QR code from your browser. I think Nick's going to take a little more time and show you how to do that, how to find it, and use
Yeah.
them to deliver some content.
So a common joke I see online is that people hate it when QR codes are used for restaurants. That some people are say, hey, give me a normal menu. But I'm here to encourage QR codes usage, especially in the classroom. And it used to be several years ago that you would need a special QR code generator. There was a bunch of noise about that. How do I find a good one? Which one is just trying to get me to pay an expensive subscription fee? How do I do this? How do I do that? Well, we've got good news. QR codes can today mostly be generated in at least two of the most common browsers, I think three, and there are extensions for browser number 4. So let's say we have a screenshot of our evaluation form and we want to make a QR code. This particular example is from Google Chrome. Another quick question for the chat. Could you please type out which internet browser you prefer using? Chrome exclamation points, Chrome exclamation points, Chrome, Chrome, a one brave Safari user. A confession for me. Does anybody know what browser I'm using right now? No? Oh, I wish it was Firefox. That would be the tech-savvy one. I'm using Edge, so I get
You're in
greeted by this every
Edge.
day. The stuffy accountant of browsers. But Susan's screenshot here is from Google Chrome. We use Edge in our computer lab right now. All right. A victory for brown ties everywhere. So Susan's particular screenshot is from Google Chrome. She has opened up her menu here and scrolling past her profile picture, scrolling past the zoom controls, scrolling past down to this little highlighted icon, we see the Cast, Save, and Share tab. Opening that at the very bottom, almost edged out of the resolution, we see Create a QR code. So Chrome has an inbuilt QR code generator, and so does Edge. Please tell me, or rather, please tell our co-hosts if you can see me finding our QR code generator here.
I can see it.
I'm going to go down to more tools. I'm going to go up to share. And find my QR code icon. And bam. These are no frills. They're native tool. It's really easy to use, and I encourage people to try it. One thing that we did not capture is Safari on Apple computers also has a QR code generator, and Firefox likely has a suitable extension.
Hey, Nick, Helen is asking what's the starting point again. Can you go back to Edge and show what the starting point was? In Chrome, it got cut off on my screenshot, but it's under the
Yeah.
three dots menu up in the top corner of your Edge browser.
Yeah, I can show on my browser. It will look very similar on Chrome. I believe the only difference is that the dots are vertical. But Helen, if you can see my green mouse circling these three dots, right between this colorful Copilot button and my profile picture.
She says she got it.
All right.
Thank you for asking.
Let's go back.
And Rebecca, did you get it now too? I see you didn't see the first time how to get to it. If not, make us slow down and do it again. It's okay.
Yeah. Another important part of the routine is repetition. If a
So
student
the
does
three
not get
dots.
that routine,
So Rebecca, are you on Chrome or are you on Edge? Chrome. Okay, can you go back to the Chrome slide with the screenshot? Right
well,
there.
Susan, why don't I take a risk and open up Chrome on this browser? On this computer, I mean. Are you still seeing Edge or are you seeing Chrome?
We're still seeing Edge. But we can see the screenshots. If you want to bring up the slide with the screenshot,
Yeah.
we can walk through that again.
Well, oh no, I've gone rogue, unfortunately.
We're off campus.
Yeah, we're off campus. So here is Chrome, and what Susan was gently nudging me to do was to show the screenshot, which would have shown these three dots. And if I go there,
All the way down to cast, save, and share, and then create QR code.
right now my own option is grayed out because this is a new Chrome tab. But if I wanted to show one of my many, if I wanted to share one of my many DL platforms, in this case, MobiMax.
Yeah, you have to actually be on a tab that has something to create a link to. Otherwise, you
Go
can't
back
create
down
the
here.
code. Rebecca says she got it. All right.
Excellent. And you can always tell when somebody made a Chrome QR code because they will include a small Tyrannosaurus.
And we like QR codes because they make it quick and easy for your students to get to your content. We don't want to be lawnmowers mowing down all of the problems in front of our students, But we also do want students to be able to get to the content within a reasonable amount of time, and QR codes can help us do that, especially when we're in a space with a lot of folks with phones. It's really easy for them to just point their phone at the QR code and get to the content. So
Yeah, they have a lot of advantages, and issues confronting them, like too many tabs being open or issues with cameras, are relatively minor.
there's a question
Uh,
from Julie. Do the QR codes expire after a certain amount of time? I am not sure about the ones in Chrome. I know that if you use one of those sort of free QR code generators on the web, those often do expire after a while. So I tend to avoid those, but I'm not sure about the ones in Chrome. Do you know, Nick, if they have an expiration on them?
Common sense wisdom gives an indefinite answer. So I've heard anywhere between 2 to 3 years, but I would generally, I think it would be good advice to recreate them every month or so,
Just in
or to
case.
keep on trucking and use them until they begin misdirecting. Some
Until they
proprietary
break.
websites, I think Mentimeter might do this, will have their QR code active for several weeks and then disable it. I think WhatsApp is another one that does that.
Yep.
WhatsApp will frequently disable QR codes within the time frame of several weeks. So, in short, it varies.
Mm-hmm. And
Go
as
on.
Nick mentioned, some of the really popular educational technology tools have built-in QR code generators. So, for example, if you're using Padlet in your class, there's a built-in QR code generator right within Padlet, which is also really handy. All right,
Yeah.
we are about 20 minutes out, so we got to get moving here. But I wanted to also just take a minute to talk about URL shorteners. So especially if you are sending students off to work on Google Docs or something like that, you'll get one of these URLs that's a mile long, right? And there is no way, if you're in a physical classroom, that students are going to be typing that link. If you're in an online Zoom or Google Meet classroom, sure, it's easy to copy paste the link and throw it in the chat, and then students can click the link. But if you're in a physical classroom with students at computers, they're not typing that thing. And they can't even probably read it, right? You want something human readable that people can look at and recognize as real words and type in their browser, which learning to type a URL in your browser is a really valuable skill. So you can practice sending people to websites with long links by making them short. And there are lots of URL shorteners out there. My favorite is tinyurl.com. So at tinyurl.com, if you just want to pop over there, Nick, quick, I'm just going to show how easy it is to use. Click that link. It's literally a few clicks. You copy the link of the thing you want people to go to, you paste it in that long, or in that first box on tinyurl where it says long link goes there. And then tinyurl, and you enter an alias. So maybe you want this to say, Northstar DL. And you hit shorten URL. And it says, oh, that's not available. Somebody's already used that. So frequently I'll end up putting a number in there just to make it less likely that somebody's taken it off. Alrighty. And then there it is. And there's a built-in copy button and a built-in QR code generator and a built-in share button right from there. So I find that to be a really useful way to send students to, like I said, long things like Google Docs that you want them to collaborate on. And you can get people to the content more quickly. And as an example, I made a tiny URL to the participant materials folder for this conference.
Uh-oh.
Oh, you've been blocked. Your browser
Well,
says, hey, that's a redirect. Nick has some
ignore
extra
this.
safety. Nick has some extra safety settings turned on his browser that prevented it from going. And that's how it works. All right, let's go back to our slides, Mr. Nick. And you're going to talk about word wall. Take it away.
All right. You'll see me checking my phone with ever-increasing franticness. Word wall is something that up to this presentation, I knew that a lot of the teachers at my learning center used, but I was relatively unfamiliar. So I surveyed them, what are some popular word wall usages? And I found out that there's a lot. They love it. It's a heavily different, it offers heavy differentiation. Ooh, stumbled on that word. It gives you a bevy of different activities with relatively unique formats, and it works very well with things like smart boards or even with QR codes on student phones. Some testimonials, some teachers have given pretty great praise for this platform. The one that really stands out to me is one of my teachers will just sit down and go through productivity sprees where they make upwards of like 10 word walls in one burst. So it seems like it's fun and addictive, maybe more addictive for teachers than students, which is a weird thing to say. Let's take a look at some of these word wall things. And we'll be aiming to look at least 3 of these. That way, if Susan needs to hurry me on, we can still maintain some time. The most common usage is matchup. I think WordWall has between 12 and 17 activities. Don't quote me on that. It's quite a lot. Matchup is a mix and match. Visit family. This is what my family looks like. July 4th. People sing on July 4th. Halloween, there's candy that's kind of like this. Give cash. Well, I see money right there. Mother's Day, there's mom. Father's Day, mom. And I'm not sure what this word is. I'm going to put it here. And this word. I forget if I had sound enabled, but there were little chimes and tinks to let me know what I got right and what I got wrong. My teachers are able to manipulate these directly via smartboard. They're able to just drag and drop like this. Students are able to access this with their fingers or like a wand. Again, very easy to use. I did it not zoomed in, but doing it like this can greatly increase visibility. There's a lot to love. But WordWall can get a little bit more complex with that. And I'll admit to being kind of a coward and really only limiting myself to things like matchup or complete the sentences, which are very textbook based. I go to school. Let's do one more. You goes to Aldi. So these are very good, and I liked the clarity of the interface, but they were also the sorts of things that you would just find in a textbook. More inventive uses of WordWall are things like crosswords.
She is from Somalia.
There's audio that plays. There's a scaffolded sentence. The word is from. I get a hint on what words were right and which words are correct.
From Somalia.
And this is what my pre-beginning, oops.
There is a woman.
This is what my pre-beginning teacher does in the PM program, Beck Wenzel. Forgiveness, Beck, if you watch this recording later. I may have mispronounced your name. They use these for their pre-beginning class, and that really got me to think about whether or not I've been underestimating, whether or not the DL teacher, have been underestimating my students' capabilities. The other one, which caught me by surprise, was whack-a-mole. This was used by our intermediate PM teacher, Jake Stimmel, and several others, if I remember correctly. And this got students into using it on their phones. They would log in. And so I walked by and I saw people tapping, and I said, Jake, do you have them on a mobile game? No, I have them on Whack-A-Mole.
Whack-A-Mole is a mobile game, Nick. It's just a
Yeah,
learning game.
yeah, it's a digital learning game. No microtransactions.
Gamification is a lot of fun.
Yeah,
And students, especially in the evening program, I find who are tired after a long day, they like to do something fun and energizing, right?
yeah. It's very good. It helps get people engaged in class. It helps break up the monotony. It's
Mhm.
another way to differentiate and also get people kind of excited or relaxed. Some other ones that I didn't really have time to cover, our medical careers teacher uses this all the time. She says she can't use it without. So I would highly recommend WordWall for your organization as a lightweight way, especially if you have a smart screen
Mhm.
in the
And
classroom.
it's also great for online classes. If you're
Mhm.
teaching on Zoom. And there is a free version of WordWall and a subscription-based version of WordWall. You can do a lot with the free version. So I would recommend checking it out. All right, we have 10 minutes to go. Let's talk about a couple of routines, one for the beginning of class and one for the end of the class. So last no two cohorts ago, when I and Nick were facilitating the best practices in digital education, no, the building an EdTech strategy toolkit cohort, the best cohort, where we're working on developing routines, I decided to modify the exit tickets that were being used in the course for the Canvas course, because I thought, you know what, there is a ton of content in this Canvas course, and I wanted to check in with people who were going through the professional development cohort. How are you feeling after getting through all of this content in Unit 1? And so I threw this question into my exit ticket. And I wanted to hear from folks. And it was really interesting. People had a mix of, I'm really excited to learn more. I feel really confident because it validated some of the things that I've already been doing, to people saying, oh my gosh, I'm overwhelmed. What have I signed myself up for? And some people were just exhausted, like, oh my gosh, this was a lot of work and I'm kind of tired now. And what people found after doing this exercise was that by processing that emotional experience that they were having, they could set that aside and then focus on the rest of the exit ticket, which was about what did you learn in this unit? And several of the teachers were so intrigued by this idea that they decided to use it to build routines for their own class to check in. And one of the teachers in particular that I'm thinking of used something very much like this image that I have here with the emojis. She had slightly fewer emojis on hers, but she put a little number next to each one of the emojis so that her beginning English students didn't have to write out the word. They could just say number 1, number 2, number 3. And then after the emotional check-in, she had one more slide, which if you want to advance to the next slide here, was about how ready are you to learn today? After checking in about your feelings, how ready are you to learn today? I'm not ready. It's hard for me today. Some things make it hard, but I'm going to try. Or 3, I'm ready. My head is clear. And she made this routine for her class on a tool called Pear Deck, which is an add-on for Google Slides. So she was putting the slide up on the screen. Everybody got out their smartphones, went to the Pear Deck link, and then joined her Pear Deck with the little code, and then could answer her questions. And because she was just having them write a number for both slides, it was pretty easy for her students, even though they didn't have a lot of language. And what she found with doing this routine of talking about, are you ready for learning, is that it slowed her down and it slowed the students down and helped them build some metacognitive skills about, well, am I ready for learning? And it helped her do things like discover, you know what, this student needs reading glasses. This student is having trouble seeing. I should have them sit in the front of the classroom. It's really bright in here. I think I should pull the blinds today. And it made her tune in more to the needs in her classroom. And it also helped the students tune into their own needs, process those, and then come up with some solutions real time in the class. So she was really happy with the routine that she built. And they built some digital literacy skills along the way. They were learning how to open a browser on their phone, write a URL, answer a poll, but really the content was what was really important for her. So Pear Deck was the tool she used, but you could also use a Padlet, you could use a Google form. There are lots of different tools that you could use. Mentimeter, Poll Everywhere. There are so many different tools you could use for this same kind of routine. And then if you want to move to the next one, the last one I've got is the other end of class, which is exit tickets. So as already talked
Yes, then.
about, an exit ticket is how I started with the emotional check-in, but an exit ticket is just a quick formative assessment that you do at the end of class to check in with how the lesson went for the students that day. And we don't have a lot of time to look at the routine, but it is linked here in your slides. The slides are in the participant materials folder, and you can get the link from there. But there's some samples in the EdTech Strategy Integration Toolkit for exit tickets. And I also made a QR code you can see here to an exit ticket for this session. So if you want to click that link there, Nick, to exit tickets, I think that one will take us actually to my exit ticket. And mine only has 2 questions, and I would love it if you would actually fill it out. You can either, if Astrid or Katie want to drop the link in the chat, you can fill it out that way, or Nick can pop back over to the slide with the QR code. So I just have 2 questions. What's something you're going to take away from today's session, and what's something that you still have a question about? And these kinds of routines, exit tickets in your classroom can help build reflection on learning and metacognitive skills in your students, and also give you information for you as a teacher on what you want to work on. Somebody in the chat said, I've lost track of, what did they say? I've lost track of something. Maybe that was a direct message.
I found it. Would you like me to read it out loud?
I found it. It was a direct message to me. I've lost count of how many workshops I have attended in my 20+ years as an educator, and I've never enjoyed a session and learned so much in such a short amount of time until now. That is the most beautiful comment I think I've ever heard from someone in a session. Thank you so much.
Yeah. Thanks a lot, and feel free to take a look at our YouTube website, which Elizabeth talked about during our opening session, for more content like this. We really cram it in.
Yes, we do.
Would you
All
like
right,
me
you
to go
have
to the
plenty of
next
time to
slide?
fill out your exit ticket. You can do it any time after the session. The last thing I want to talk about before we wrap for the day is just that overview of the best course cohort. So those last two routines that I talked about are drawn from this cohort. If you would like to go deep and learn more and develop routines of your own, and you are a Minnesota adult educator, you can sign up for this cohort, and Nick and I and Kathy will be facilitating it next winter and spring. Watch your ABE Connect for sign up information, probably in December or so. And if you are not a Minnesota adult educator, if your state is a member of the Ideal Consortium, you can ask your state leaders to offer it in your state. And if you're not a member of the Ideal Consortium, talk to your state leaders about joining. And this link here takes you to the Ideal membership, so you can check it out and see if your state is a member. And that's all I have for you. Thank you so much for coming. Is there anything else I can answer for you today? Any other last questions or comments?
Thank you so much, Susan and Nick. This is an excellent session. Katie's put some information in the chat about with the event flyer and the DL Help Desk and DL website. I'm going to stop the recording now. We are going to be taking a lunch break and then coming back to sessions in a little bit.
Yeah, you have 45 minutes for lunch. See you back here this afternoon.